It's not very often that I get to talk about romance. In fact, I don't really even think I watch romance as a genre all that much. However, when I do, I'm usually reminded of why so many of you suck at writing romance.
Yeah, buddy! Wait!
Now, as a manly man who has no feelings or desires whatsoever, the only thing I really ever do enjoy is cool, sweaty, muscular dudes ripping off their shirts and crushing smaller men between their pectorals. However, I will occasionally get a craving to watch two people fall in love and be cute with one another. Not only that, but I think one of the reasons you might suck at writing romance is because you don't take any opportunities to show how two lovers protect one another. Or rather, you fall into something a bit too typical and use it as a crutch for the relationship. In other words, just because someone is willing to take a bullet for you, that doesn't mean that they're a good romantic partner. Oftentimes, our early understandings of relationships are that of the damsel in distress and the knight in shining armor. A hero saving their romantic interests can be a wonderful way to write an engaging relationship, but heroism on its own is not romantic. When we hear about a knight slaying a dragon to save the princess, we often think about how the princess is destined to be betrothed to that knight. But beyond heroism, what do the knight and the princess actually have in common? When writing a romance which is founded on one party protecting the other, it's important to remember this question. If the only thing one person admires about another is that they are strong and protective, while the other finds them beautiful or something shallow, there's a high chance that their romantic chemistry just doesn't exist. But speaking of protection, I wanted to take a chance to talk about how to protect your private information online with today's sponsor, Aura. I want you guys to think about a time when a company you trusted announced a data breach involving your personal information. What went through your mind as you processed the news? What actions did you take to respond? And most importantly, what actions did you not take to respond? Because not responding or taking any action in this moment right now could leave you vulnerable to future data breaches. After all, hackers may have stolen the social security numbers of every American. So, if you live in America like I do, you might want to listen to what I have to say. Over 2.9 billion records were stolen from National Public Data, which offers personal information to employers, private investigators, staffing agencies, and others doing background checks. These stolen records include a person's full name, address, date of birth, social security number, and phone number, along with alternate names and birth dates. And members of the hacker group have reportedly released this information for free online. I don't know about you guys, but as a person who has had their passwords stolen in the past, that sort of thing is incredibly terrifying to me. Oftentimes we think it can't happen to us until it does, and we're left without any idea of what to do or who to call. Even if you're doing your best to keep your identity safe, things like this can still happen. And by the time you realize it has happened, it'll already be too late. That's why it's so important to get ahead of it and prepare for the worst. If you weren't taking precautions with your personal information online before, this should be a huge wake-up call. You've never been more vulnerable online than you are right now. But for me personally, I'm not too worried because I use Aura. Aura alerts me if my phone number, email, or social security number is on the dark web. They're going to let me know fast if anyone tries to use this information to get access to my credit or bank accounts. They also give me up to $5 million in identity theft insurance should the worst case scenario ever happen to me again. There's also a ton of other features to keep you safe online, all inside one easy-to-use app. You can go to my link, aura.com/scrit, to try 14 days for free. That will be enough time for Aura to find out if any of your personal data has been exposed. I highly recommend you do this right now because not only is National Public Data not going to do anything to help you, they're probably not going to face any repercussions for this leak. And if there aren't any repercussions, that more than likely means it's going to happen again. I'm not leaving myself vulnerable to data breaches, and if you don't want to either, you can go to aura.com/scrit and try 2 weeks for free. Anyways, back to the rest of the video. When I think of my favorite romances, I think only a small portion of them actually fall under the romance genre. Dandadan has one of the most adorable, realistic, and genuinely fun romances in all of fiction, and yet it is a battle shonen. And for the anime-only watchers, don't worry, I won't spoil too much. As I've mentioned in prior videos, Both Okarun and Momo have an incredibly good romantic chemistry, which goes far and above even most rom-coms. I think what sets apart Okarun and Momo's relationship are the small details. The way that Momo bumps into Okarun or tries to physically be close with him. The way that the two of them defend each other's honor when they're not in the room with each other. Seeing the way that these two will protect each other even when the other won't know that they're doing it. I just love watching and reading about the way these two goobers really want to hang out with one another to the point that they go looking for each other only to spend all of their lunch hour searching because they keep barely missing each other. Right down to all of those moments of silent contemplation and pining that they do when they're separated from each other in the story. You can always tell when Okarun or Momo are thinking of one another. Most of all, I think what Dandadan gets correct and where other romances go wrong is Dandadan shows a mutual effort and interest from both parties to spend time together. Something like this goes for any type of relationship, but it's especially true for romantic relationships. If only one party in a relationship is seeking the other out and trying to spend time with them, then it's very likely that that relationship is not going to last. And yeah, a lot of people could say, well, what if one of them is an introvert and the other is an extrovert? That still applies though, because that's exactly what Okarun and Momo are. Yeah, Okarun is shy, he's introverted, he has trouble asking for things that he wants, but the story goes through lengths to actually show what he wants to us and show how he struggles for it. And a lot of the times, he will overcome that feeling just so he can spend more time with Momo. Just the same, Momo is the type of person who's perfect for helping Okarun get out of his shell, especially when she notices those times when Okarun doesn't seem to want to talk or do anything. She'll go out of her way to make contact with him and spend time with him. If you've ever struggled making genuine friends in real life, or feeling as though the people who are supposed to be your friends are not really making an effort for you, try to stop contacting them first while you meet new people. Now, I'm not saying ghost them or don't respond to them if they message you. I'm saying don't initiate the conversation and go out to find some new people. Because if people want you around, they will seek you out. If people are thinking of you, they're going to make an effort to be around you. Don't worry about not having any friends. It's a lot more lonely to be surrounded by people who don't care about you than it is to be with one person who does. Now, I'm not saying to put your lover through some sort of petty purity test to see if they actually care about you, or that your lover should be the only person you ever interact with. It's important to surround yourself with all types of relationships, but it is equally important to recognize who is a true friend or lover to you and who is merely a friendly acquaintance. I also think it's important to observe how your efforts are reciprocated in any relationship you try to build, even if it is something small like someone sending memes to you or starting a conversation. Or when you're hanging out and everybody else leaves, they'll find an opportunity to stick around and continue talking with you. If you're still in school, think about the people who make an effort to hang out with you outside of school hours. And if you have people in your life like that, then try to do the same to them every now and then. These are telltale signs that someone wants to interact with and be around you. If you find you're always the one who initiates with all of your friends and loved ones, that might not necessarily mean that they secretly hate you or don't think of you, but it does mean that you should put in some effort to seeking out people who will also seek you out. With Dandadan, there is no shortage of characters who exhibit this behavior. Even characters who we know are destined to always be friends also have an extremely good romantic chemistry with one another. Dandadan is a show about people caring for one another. Beyond all the spirits, aliens, and wacky hijinks, the thing which makes the relationships of Dandadan shine so much are the small moments where we get to see the many ways these characters take care of each other. Dandadan knows how to introduce a character that you hate, only to then make you absolutely adore them by the end of their arc. And it's when we get to see characters develop from antagonists to love interests that I think we see our most compelling type of romantic dynamic. Enemies to lovers is an extremely strong romantic trope in fiction which almost never gets old for me. Kiara and Kovu from The Lion King 2, Jon Snow and Ygritte from Game of Thrones, Vi and Kate or Jinx and Echo from Arcane, Han Solo and Princess Leia from Star Wars, Ash and Misty from Pokemon, Joe Biden and Trump from the American election. The list goes on and on and on. The thing I think makes Enemies to Lovers so compelling is that it forces writers to introduce something with their characters that many of them forget to write when writing romantic relationships: independence and agency. We are often trained to think of lovers as two halves of the same whole, people who complete one another and who would be incomplete without each other. And while this can be true to some extent, I think a healthier way to view relationships is less of two halves making a single whole, and rather two wholes coming together to create something greater than the sum of their parts. In order to achieve a romantic relationship like that, it is important to introduce some level of independence and agency with both characters. While you're writing, show the ways in which two lovers differ and quarrel, but also show how those differences provide context to their love. Where I think a lot of romantic relationships in fiction tend to fall short is when there's only one character with a strong personality or any sort of development, whereas the romantic interest is seemingly defined by their relationship to them. Enemies to Lovers is a dynamic which very easily defeats this pitfall by establishing one as an antagonist and the other as a protagonist. In other words, the writer is forced to create motivations and roles for these characters so that they can contribute more to the story beyond just being interested in one another. They are two sides of the same coin with strong personalities, beliefs, and convictions. Otherwise, you'd have a very boring protagonist or a very boring antagonist. When we see these two characters clash, we can often find that there's a very thin and blurred line between hatred and love. It's to the point that sometimes writers don't fully realize how compatible two characters actually are until audiences start shipping them together. Enemies to Lovers also combos well with another trope that I think I don't really know the name of, but which I will refer to as trial by combat. This is a romantic relationship which has some intersectionality with Enemies to Lovers, but with a key difference that these two combatants do not always need to start as enemies. They can be rivals, training partners, companions, or competitors who gain respect and admiration for one another during their clash. However, a trial by combat does not always need the two lovers to clash, nor does it need to be physical combat. The combat in this case can be any sort of conflict, competition, or scenario where either party proves their competence for the other to admire. There are few things more attractive than watching someone perform a task with extreme competence. An example I would give as a trial by combat romantic scenario is from a little show called Shokugeki no Soma, or Food Wars. From the very beginning, it is very clear that our main character, Soma Yukihira, is meant to inevitably be the love interest for Erina Nakiri. Soma fills the low-born rogue archetype, whereas Erina fills the noble heiress type. Now, we're in a modern-day setting where instead of fighting, you have food cooking competitions. But there is a lot of allegory and analogy used in the show, which ends up making it so that you don't really need an actual fight to take hold. The show in and of itself is a great example of how you can have a fight or competition that feels like a fight, but which actually isn't fighting. Where Soma represents the hole-in-the-wall mom-and-pop diners, Erina represents fine dining. On top of that, Erina is sheltered and hoisted to be some sort of goddess among the food world, a prodigy who has never known defeat. Meanwhile, Soma's competency comes directly from his many losses to his father. He learns through failure and trying things that might not work, but which you can't rule out anyway. Soma has an appreciation for even the bad combinations of food, whereas Erina believes that everything you cook must be perfect. Their first meeting ends in disaster, with Erina telling him that his cooking fucking sucks, even though it's pretty clear that she kinda likes it. The real issue with Soma's cooking isn't that it sucks, but rather what it represents to her. Soma is a failure, which Erina is told to be above. He represents a path of cooking which is inherently imperfect, but which is also necessary for finding new ways to cook. Soma is not afraid of failure, and in fact, it is his greatest strength. A strength which Erina comes to admire over the course of the show. At first, she regards Soma's admittance to Tatsuki Academy as a mistake waiting to be corrected. But trial after trial, Soma proves her wrong, and through his own competence, garners a begrudging respect. A respect which later grows into admiration and then love. It's not really until the end of the show that we see these two compete directly with one another. In fact, they end up working together a lot sooner than they end up competing. All the same, this is what a trial by combat romance looks like. And it doesn't need to be one-sided either. Where Soma was proving himself to Erina, it was not for Erina. And later on in the story, we see numerous moments where Erina ends up proving herself to Soma as well. Rivals can become lovers, and they can end up inspiring us and pushing us to do better than we otherwise would. This is something which can easily be done wrong, such as in the case of Danmachi. Oh, Danmachi, one of the shows that I love to hate. A show I started watching in high school, which I still keep up with to this day, despite how god-awful the writing is. And if you're a fan of Danmachi, I've nothing against you. I'm also a fan. I think there's actually a lot of merit and reasons to enjoy Danmachi. However, what's frustrating to me as a viewer is how many good concepts are just executed so poorly in that show. At the very least, they're a great example of what not to do when it comes to executing a good concept. Namely, the trial by combat romance dynamic. See, where something like Shokugeki shows an initial denial and conflict between two characters with clashing ideals, Danmachi does none of that. The main love interest in Danmachi is between Belle Cranel and Eis Wallenstein. Why did I say it like that? Eis Wallenstein. I'm white. Well, I guess Germans are white. Whatever, anyways, the romance begins when Belle encounters a minotaur from the lower floors of the dungeon which has wandered into the upper floors. Eis ends up saving him from that minotaur, and from there on, Belle is smitten with her. That one act of heroism ends up being the only thing that Belle really latches onto, which is something that I advised against earlier in this video. When we think of Belle and Eis's relationship and why they like each other, it's very difficult to come up with any answers at all. Belle is a shy, meek, and generally kind person who possesses a unique ability that allows him to increase his strength faster than anyone else in history. Eis Wallenstein was the previous record holder for the fastest level up in the city and is known to be one of the strongest, if not the strongest, adventurer in all the lands. But what do they actually like about each other, though? Well, I mean, Belle was saved by her one time, and Eis thinks he's kind? It's kind of hard to know exactly what Eis admires about him. Perhaps the times when they train together, she develops a mutual respect for him, but we rarely see Eis seeking him out or pining over him. A lot of the effort and admiration is one-sided between these two, and Belle is almost entirely defined by his love for Eis. In fact, it's the source of his power throughout the story. Belle only progresses his strength as fast as he does because he wants to stand by her side as an equal, and Eis doesn't really do anything in response, I'm gonna be honest with you. While Belle is chasing after an ideal and denying every single better option along the way, we're left wanting when it comes to any sort of romantic chemistry or justification for why we should care about this relationship. There isn't any reason for these two to actually like each other. Kindness is not inherently romantic, nor is heroism or competence. Nearly every moment that Belle triumphs, it goes unseen by Eis. Nearly every interaction between the two is pretty much either one-sided, platonic, or just boring. And to make matters worse, any other female character that happens to fall in love with Belle is also a one-sided relationship, which is frustratingly shirked off to the side and played as a joke. All the while, Belle is defined almost entirely by his desire to become Eis's lover, and Eis is closer to an object than an actual character. she's a trophy to be won by the protagonist and not her own person. Yeah, she's seen as a strong and well-respected character, but that's just what people tell us. We very rarely ever truly get to see it happen. We don't really get to see any truly cool moments of Aiz being more than a bland, emotionless, somewhat strong character. This is why I think there are so many poorly done romances in fiction, though. When we write our stories, we often write from one perspective, that being our own perspective. When we draw upon our own romantic encounters in life, we can often be so blinded by infatuation or love that we never considered how our lover felt during the time that we were pursuing them. This transitions to my next point as to why you might suck at writing romance. And it's pretty simple. You're not developing your characters enough. When writers make a romance, we usually only see one character chasing while the other character exists to be chased, and yet has seemingly nothing to be chased for. We see relationships where one character is wholly reliant on the other to exist and whose personality is entirely centered around their love for that other character. And I think that might come from a place where writers will often be writing from their own experiences with love rather than their experience watching other people fall in love. Now, I haven't kept up with this show, so maybe this has changed, but one of the critiques I could levy at a show like Hell of a Boss is the relationship between Moxie and Millie, where Moxie gets a great deal of episodes dedicated to his characterization, backstory, and development. Millie always seems to be cut in line and reduced to being Moxie's wife. This becomes apparent when we compare the episodes in which we meet their respective families. That being Season 1, Episode 5, where we are introduced to Millie's family, and Season 2, Episode 3, where we are introduced to Moxie's family. Now, you would think that an episode dedicated to meeting Millie's family would be about Millie and her relationship with her parents, or why she is the way she is. But it's actually more of an episode about Moxie's insecurities surrounding Millie. It's all about Moxie comparing himself to someone he thinks would be a better fit for Millie, and needing Millie to come in and reassure him that she does, in fact, still love him more. With this pattern established, you would think we would do the same when we're introduced to Moxie's family. Perhaps an episode where we get to see some of Millie's insecurities about their relationship. We even introduce her old ex, who also happens to be Moxie's old ex. Millie once again has to take a back seat so we can delve into all of Moxie's deep insecurities, trauma, and reasons for loving Millie. Then Millie comes in and rescues him from his shitty family by the end of the episode. Then, in Season 2, Episode 5, we see an episode where Millie gets to be the center of attention, only for Moxie to once again steal the episode and the spotlight by making it about his insecurities surrounding Millie. Throughout this, we are almost expected to believe that this is a mutual, functional, and loving relationship. But in actuality, the only thing we can understand as an audience is that Millie is both defined by her relationship with Moxie, as well as far too good of a lover for Moxie. We never get to see Millie's insecurities in the relationship. We never get to see what drives her or motivates her as a character beyond being related to Moxie. She is always the one who must come in and fix everything for Moxie. She needs to reassure Moxie at all times and love him unconditionally. Where Moxie is allowed to be flawed and insecure, Millie must be perfect. She's not allowed to have any agency or interests of her own which aren't directly tied to her relationship with Moxie. I don't even really know what motivates her to do her job in the first place beyond the fact that she's Moxie's wife and wants to help him out. This is not what a good romantic relationship looks like. Perhaps it's what a somewhat realistic relationship can look like, but it's also not something that ever lasts. If one side of the relationship is always insecure and absorbed in their own hang-ups while the other is constantly having to drag them out of their self-centered viewpoint, that is not a healthy relationship. It's also not an endearing one to watch. If anything, it's frustrating if you're a fan of Millie's character. It always feels like she's cut in line by her own lover whenever the opportunity arises to make an episode about her. And by the end of it, when we question who she is without Moxie, we find the answer somewhat lacking. So whenever you're making a romantic couple in your story, it's important that you provide the audience with an equal chance to understand each character in the relationship. You should create moments where we get to see who they are without their lover, and that will often make the romantic pairing all the stronger for it. For those who have watched my other videos, you might have heard me talk about this before, but another reason you might suck at writing romance is that you've tamed the tomboy. Now, there's probably a more educated term for such a thing, but I'm more of a sorcerer than a wizard when it comes to writing, so I'm just gonna call it whatever feels right and sticks in my head. Taming the tomboy is basically when a character, typically a very interesting or feisty tomboy, turns into a tradwife the moment they get into a relationship with their chosen lover. The strongest example of this is Darling in the Franxx, wherein Zero Two goes from being one of the most compelling, flawed, and interesting characters in the show, and I would argue in fiction, to a tame, agreeable tradwife. What we need to understand about relationships is that your trauma and your flaws do not magically disappear once you find someone to love. In fact, they often become obstacles for which your relationship is tested. I get it. We want to believe that all of the pining, longing, and chasing was worthwhile, and that once people get together, they will live happily ever after without issue. However, it is a far more healthy and compelling tale to tell when we depict those conflicts being overcome rather than removing them for the sake of a happy ending. Of course, I'm not advising that you force a conflict to happen between lovers, as that is, in and of itself, its own separate issue. What I'm suggesting is that you do not forget the flaws and conflicts in motivation between your two romantic characters. They won't always be in alignment on everything. If I were to rewrite Zero Two's character after getting into a relationship, it would be very easy to put her into the role of someone who feels insecure or undeserving of their happy ending, much in the same way that Moxie from Hell of a Boss does. Someone who is protective of Hiro and perhaps even jealously greedy about the time that she spends with him. This would introduce conflict not just between Hiro and Zero Two, but also Hiro and the rest of the cast. Zero Two would likely want to monopolize Hiro's time once they are committed to one another, and probably would start fights with the other girls of the group as a way of defending her man. And while I would not personally write her to do anything particularly cruel to them, it is definitely behavior which would have to be called out and reconciled during the story. Zero Two's love for Hiro comes from her early childhood memories. The fact that he was the first person to show her what the outside world looks like, and what it felt like to be treated as something more than a weapon or an experiment. Hiro is her humanity, but I think it would be best for Hiro to serve as the person who teaches her that she has always been and always will be more than a weapon. Hiro should not be her humanity for long. He should be the one who helps her find it within herself. As the relationship develops, I think it would be best for Hiro to show Zero Two how to interact with the other members of the cast and find relationships with them which are outside of romance. I would even dedicate episodes where Zero Two is separated from her new boyfriend and at odds with one of the other members of the group, only to find that they have a lot more in common by the end of it. What Zero Two needs is not to remove all of her interesting flaws and quirks, but rather to realize that Hiro is not the only person who can make her feel like a human being. I also think that it would be important to show Hiro growing beyond his initial nature as well, to basically follow a similar arc to someone like Simone from Gurren Lagann, starting as a meek and insecure person and growing into a leader for his group. Someone who always had that determination and sense of self to be a leader, but who just needs a little push from someone who believes in the person they can be. Someone who wears their heart on their sleeve. Someone like Zero Two, who shows him all the things that he didn't recognize about himself, but that she has always seen within him. This would be a relationship where both of them become better and more complete people, perhaps needing to rely on one another at first, but in the end being wholly independent characters whose growth was spurred on by one another. But, Space Bride or whatever. To sum up, the reasons you might suck at writing romances are all character writing issues at their core. You must allow your story to breathe and allow your characters to show their attraction for one another in small ways. You must allow your characters to exist outside of their romantic interests for each other and show the audience what makes them a lovable character in the first place. Because if you can get the audience to love them, you can get the audience to understand why somebody else would love them too. Most of all, pay attention when you're writing. Allow it to show you which characters actually have good chemistry and which ones don't. Sometimes we will go into a story with a certain plan, only to end up writing about a character who is a much better fit than the one we initially planned for. A lot of life is similar to that. We all have an ideal lover in our heads, but the more we try to fit human beings into that ideal, the less those relationships will work out. So learn to appreciate characters and people as they are. Learn to love them for all their quirks and flaws. Open up a document and start writing. Oh, and if you've already started writing and you want to know if you're on the right track or if your writing is any good in my opinion or not, then check out my channel memberships. For $10 and above, I will personally give my impressions, critiques, and suggestions on whatever you write. Also, sometimes we VC and I bloviate for several hours about random shit in my life. Alright, goodbye.